Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Eveland. We're going to get started. We might be waiting for a few folks still trying to log in here, but I'm going to get started with the introductions. Appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy week to be with us today. My name is Jeff Eveland. I'm with TxMQ. This is the second installment in our TxMQ Work Smarter webinar series. You may have already caught our first initial installment covering, IBM MQ upgrade best practices. But today we have a continuation of that discussion around IBM MQ upgrades and how to better organize your team for a large scale upgrade. If you're not familiar with us, see at TxMQ, we're a consulting, staffing, and development shop, and we focus a lot in the middleware space and the integration space. And overall, we're technology agnostic and work with just about everything out there. And among all these technologies, we understand IBM MQ is important to many of the businesses and industries we work with. Something a lot of us are passionate here about TxMQ. That's why we're happy to be able to share some of this information with you today. So I have John Carr here. He is a senior solutions architect with the TxMQ team. He's put together a great presentation, so I'm going to throw it over to him. Let him take it from here.
Hello, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My name is John Carr, I work here at TxMQ, and as Jeff says, we're got this Work Smarter initiative that we're trying to do, help our customers be able to uh, uh, hear from us from experience working out in the trenches, whether it's MQ or other technologies. So we'll go through and we will get started here. The presentation overview. And first thing I have to go through and say is that this session may not feel as technical as the previous one that I did for actually doing MQ upgrades to version 9. This presentation right here is more about how to try to go through and organize your teams and maybe even go about how would you approach the application teams using MQ products as well. We'll go through and we'll talk about with the main section about organizing your MQ team, organization of your environment, some ideas on how to be able to go through and engage the application teams. We'll walk through a server build scenario and then a simple migration scenario. And I'll point out a couple of things as we go through certain sections of the presentation when I'll go through and I'll indicate, okay, here are activities that would be part of your server build team versus your application enablement team. As part of our TxMQ Work Smart series, thing I could go through and refer you to is the presentation that we did a couple of months ago on the MQ version 9 upgrade best practices. That gets even, I would consider this presentation a companion to this one that I got a link here for. So after you visit or watch this webinar, I encourage you to watch this other webinar to be able to get a more holistic view of how to be able to go through and work smart with MQ, and even reach out to us here at TxMQ to see how we could be able to help you with your needs. Now, organizing your teams, and this goes through a lot of experience that I've personally gone through, and especially now going through the DevOps movement. I've noticed that people are in different stages now when it comes to getting into DevOps, and now trying to go and bring in technologies like MQ into that arena. Um, what I notice in a nutshell is a lot of shops are just now in this twilight where they're doing more than just dipping their toes into a DevOps. But at the same time, I think people kind of get a little bit wound around the axle about when they go through and try to introduce new technologies and new processes to go through and support DevOps. And I'm more about taking a common sense approach because, especially with MQ, as you know, that it is an enterprise messaging oriented technology, and it's used by the backbone in the industry as well. So we do want to go through and with your site or with your shop that you're working with, whether you have 2 or 3 queue managers, or you may have hundreds of queue managers that you go through and support, to go through and think of as you were dealing with large-scale deployments as a journey where you may not have everything organized all at once, but gradually working towards this total DevOps environment. And that's kind of how I'm approaching this uh, uh, webinar. So one thing is the biggest challenge is where to go through and start. Well, we go through and talk about dividing into 3 groups, which would be a leadership group, a server build group, and an application enablement group. So for organizing your team, and some of this may be common sense, but most people will go through and do things like this. Well, there will be an MQ leadership team, 1 or 2 people who might go through and be considered the team leads. And then you go through and you get yourself a PM or a Kanban coach as well. And then from there, you go through and you break up between 2 smaller groups, a server build group and an application enablement group. And this always goes in subject to debate because especially with DevOps, I think it seems to be people are more inclined to say, well, people should be able to go through and work in either camp, whether it's a server build group or an application enablement group. They should be able to do work one day in the server build group and then do work another day in the application enablement group. I'm one to go through and say that might be true down in the future, but to go and start off with something that will go through and have some skills that would be specific to each group and have a person be assigned to that one group to be able to go through and help mature it. So then a couple of years down the road or a year down the road, that when you're trying to go to the next level with your DevOps journey, that then you would already have a mature pipeline together for both server build and also application enablement. One of the big things that I'm always been a big fan on is dealing with Kanban. And Kanban is a method of managing the creation of products with an emphasis on continual delivery while not overburdening the development team. It's like Scrum, Kanban is a process designed to help teams work together more efficiently. In this case, that quote came from version 1 about what is Kanban. One thing that I learned that really works well is if you go through and if you follow, in this case, between Scrum and Kanban, I prefer Kanban a little bit better. It's easier as an MQ team. The reality is that we're not really developers, we're also admins. So we have to go through and we have to support current initiatives, support the current MQ network, for example, the day-to-day tickets and stuff that come in, incidents, and then also go through and do any type of upgrades that need to be done, upgrading to version 9, for example. And Kanban seems to work well in my opinion, on being able to go through and have cards up on a board to go and identify, here are incidents that I am working on. Here is migration activities that I'm working on for the day. Here's things that's in testing, things that are in backlog. And anytime I go to any type of site for consulting, I'd go through and if they're not using a board, I'd go through and create a Kanban board for them. And it's good to see that slowly being adopted. And besides that, your CIO would love teams adopting this into their culture. When you go through and you have your 15-minute stand-up meetings, believe me, at first, it's going to go longer than 15 minutes. It could go 90 minutes at times. Work yourself to be able to have 15-minute meetings. And then you could go through after your 15 minutes, state, this is what I did yesterday, this is what I'm doing today, here's my impediment. Anything that requires further discussion would be after the 15-minute stand-up, because that's really important as well. So people could be able to go through within the team and hear what other people are working on, because if someone's having a problem or someone is working on something else that someone has a little knowledge of, that's where team members could raise their hands and be able to go through and say, hey, I could be able to give you a hand there if you need it. An example for organizing your teams. Remember I was saying you'd have 2 teams. One I'd recommend would be like a server build team. The other one would be an application enablement team. An example, and this right here, when we're going through and we're talking, um, I'm going through and talking maybe more along the lines of on-prem development. A future webinar that I'll do in a few months will be specific for cloud enablement. But by organizing yourself this way, still in this manner between a server build team and an application team, even for on-prem work, we'll be able to go through and actually streamline you better in the future when you start going through and migrating to the cloud. So as an example, for the server build team, they'd be involved with setting the kernel params, ulinit settings, defining the file systems, going through and actually doing the MQ server install, set up any type of clustering, general MQ configs, certificate management. And then on the other side for application activities, that's where we go through, and the application activities would involve working with the application teams that are going to be migrated over, where any type of specific firewall requests that need to be done, connecting to an MQ cluster, moving over the MQ objects, establishing security, testing, custom monitoring rules, that would fall on the application team side. And how large can these groups be? They could be as small as 2 people or as large as 4 or 5 people. But again, especially in this day and age where we're trying to go through and head toward more cloud-enabled economies of scale deployments, I still say the first step is to be able to go through and build out your pipelines, and it'll still require a little bit of specializations, and that's why I'm saying that you'd have 2 teams. Each team would go through and focus on their respective activities. When it comes to organizing of your environment, if you notice up here on the upper left-hand side, I go through and indicate this would be part of the server build group. This is where, as part of the server build group, as an example, for organizing their environment, always remember the basics for standards. They'll be involved with the server naming standards, queue manager naming, environment designations, how to configure virtual or physical servers as well. That's what the server group would be involved with. Naming standards, I always like stressing this because I know not every shop seems to support it, especially if they only have to maintain 2 or 3 queue managers. You want to go through and treat your servers and your queue managers like cattle, not pets. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit funny, but really, in the end, a pet has a personalized name, you care for it, and then when it's sick, you go and you take care of it. Where in the end, we don't want to go through and name our queue managers based off of Snow White and the 7 Dwarves. For example, we want to treat them more like cattle, where the queue managers or even the servers would go through and have an assigned number. They're usually identical, and then they could be replaced when they're not in good health. This gets more into the DevOps concept, where instead of treating your servers and your queue managers like individual pets, you treat them more like cattle. You brand them, you number them. If they need to be replaced, you could replace them quite easily. And it doesn't matter the size of your network. This right here is just nothing more than an example, simple example that I actually just threw together to go through and show where it says MSXYNNN. That would go through and represent the actual server name. And then like MS could go through and mean messaging services, for example. An X, whether it's V or B, might go through and represent whether it's a physical or a virtual machine. A Y would go through and indicate what type of environment are we talking about, non-prod stage, production, proof of concept. And then, of course, then you go through and give the queue manager type and then a queue manager number. This right here is more what I consider branding, where you're going through and you're treating, again, your queue managers and your servers more like cattle. And you can see where that's going to come in handy as we go further along. As part of organizing your environment, Every shop is different, and especially when you're going and getting into the cloud, you may not have as many environments. You may just go through and have two, which would be, let's say, like a dev environment and prod. Other shops may go through and be able to break them out more granularly, where they'll have a proof of concept environment, which could be made up of packaged sandboxes, parking lots, or even an application sandbox. This would be something on the left-hand side. That would be an example of something that you want to go through and maybe try out for proof of concepts. Maybe a new version of MQ you want to go through and try out, or something that might be for an application team that they just want to dip their toes into trying a new version of MQ without um, committing to going through and getting a full environment set up. Non-prod, and we'll go through this a little bit more. Of course, non-prod would go through and represent queue managers that are established. It could be part of the MQ network um, for routing of messages. Stage and production. And if we go and switch over between the lower environments, again, lower environments examples could be, they could be virtual servers, and these are decisions that the server build group would go through and put together for lower environments. They could be set up as virtual servers, single instance, not multi-instance, let's say. There might be no load balancing set up on them. They're simple yet purpose-driven. For the upper environments right here, for your large scale deployments, you may go through and have your QA, your pre-prod, and your prod environments, where they're all multi-instance. They could go through and have some type of file replication that you could now do in version 9.1, or they might still use what I still call the classic shared disks topology between active and standby. They go through, in this case, in an upper environment, your server group will go through and say, we want to go and establish F5 or NetScaler, for example, for any type of application load balancing. Cluster management, for example. And of course, you want stage to be set up as close as possible to production. When it comes to engaging of the application teams, this would be a separate group here within your MQ group. And in the end, with the application enablement group, what I think really works well, because I've seen it work in 3 or 4 shops now, is that the members of this team would go through and conduct open office hours. And a part of that open office hours, they do it every week, like let's say Wednesdays at 10 a.m., for example. The point is, especially for larger shops, that you may have dozens of or even hundreds of application teams that are using your queue managers. That's a point where maybe they're not completely ready to go through the process of the complete MQ upgrade yet, but they just want to go and learn about what is going to be involved with the MQ upgrade when they're ready. And it could be their time to be able to go through and ask questions about TLS 1.2 standards, any security, or how the load balancing is going to go through and work. Again, it would be open office hours, and once you get a team that's ready to go and be committed to go and work, with having their key managers being upgraded, then you go through and assign them somebody from the application enablement team, and I'll describe some of that work later on what would be more specific. Some of the information that in these next 3 slides I'll show here, some of the information that I'd be giving during these weekly sessions, or especially when someone's finally ready to jump into the water and start the upgrade, is you want to go through and give these application teams information about saying, okay, here's an example. If you're using Web Server Application Server version 7 or 8.5, we're requiring you to use TLS 1.2 authentication. Here's the example of the cipher spec that we would go and set on the MQ channel. Here's the cipher suite that we would go through and require you to set on your side for your resource adapter, let's say. If you're using a resource adapter at level 8, an MQ resource adapter on WAS, this is how we would expect the Cypher suite and the Cypher spec to be set. This is really important information to give the application teams as much information as necessary. And I consider this as being on the application enablement MQ side to be able to address these issues of what Cypher suites and specs to be able to go through and set up when they're engaging with these teams. So then the application teams could be ready for these things. Another example right here, SSL Cypher specs over TLS 1.2 if you're dealing with standalone Java, for example. Okay, if you're using MQ Java Client Library 7 or 7.5, this is what we recommend the Cypher suite and Cypher spec to go and be set as. So again, this is information you want to give upfront to these application teams. Let it be a discussion with them, and even go through and have it out in your SharePoint or some type of common documentation library, so that an application team would have enough information to be able to go and run on their side to be ready for the MQ upgrade. Because as we all know, as being MQ administrators, we're always pulled into issues with application teams on not being able to connect to a queue manager or other types of issues. And the more information that we could go and give them up front, the less phone calls that we would go and have on dealing with matters like this. So this would be an example of information that I would go through and be sharing with those application teams up front. And again, it would be the MQ application enablement group that would be giving this information to them. Other things as part of these open office hours would be to kind of go through and give them a thumbnail, when I say them, the application teams, an example of how, when you're migrated, how your applications, how they used to connect to the queue managers and how they're going to be connecting in the future. So this is just an example right here. As an example, telling the application teams, okay, each application will be using their own server con channel for connecting to a queue manager. You're going to go through an F5 switch as an example. In the back end, you'll have a like a primary server and a standby queue manager waiting for you. LDAP will be used for authentication and authorization. And again, as part of documentation for an application, let's say that they're not using LDAP, you'd go through and give them some basic information about, as an MQ developer, here is how LDAP authentication would go and work within WAS, as an example. And you don't have to be a WAS expert for that, but just to give them enough information and point them to maybe a few links as well, just so that the application teams have enough information to know how to be able to get the ball rolling. So that's something else that's important as part of these weekly meetings that you have with these teams. Other activity for the application enablement group, the office hours should be held weekly. Again, same time, same day. Use the time for general discussions with the application teams. It's really meant as more of onboarding. This makes more sense if you're part of a large shop where you have dozens of application teams that you work with. But this is a good way to be able to get them marshaled together, and the ones that are already ready to say, yeah, we'll take a dive on this. Then you go through and you assign them an MQ admin from this application team to be able to help them go through their upgrade activities. And some slides coming up will go through and give a few ideas what will be involved with that. Now, coming to a server build scenario. So I'm switching back to the server build group within your MQ team. Even for on-prem, if you go through and you start thinking about I try to go through and tell clients about, even though you may still be dealing with on-prem upgrades, let's say, of your environments, if you start trying to go through and think of them more DevOps like, try to go through and write out more scripts, try to go through and automate more. By the time that you truly have to go through and upgrade out to the IBM Cloud or AWS or Google Cloud, that you'll already go and have a system in place and then introduce a few new technologies. Think about today how it generally works. You got a new request, you might go through and submit it through ServiceNow or something, where service catalog requests, let's say, it'll go to an operations manager, and you go through, you as an MQ team member go and say, hey, I need a new Linux machine. Okay, I need a new Linux VM setup. And then what will happen is that'll be assigned to a Linux admin. The Linux admin will go through and create that server for you, and then close the ticket saying, I'm done. And of course, how do you know if all that's correct? And as part of DevOps is becoming more and more where even the MQ build team will be literally involved with actually provisioning of the servers instead of handing them off to another group. But in the event that you're dealing with a group where someone else is building out the Linux environment, let's say, for you, and setting up the file systems based off of the specs that you gave, you still need to go through and you still need to verify that. So as part of your group, one thing is you go through, in a nutshell, you go through and you have what I affectionately call a coordination server. And you could go through and consider this in terms of AWS. They may go through and start calling this like a pipeline, but you could actually do this with on-prem as well. It's a simple coordination server that you could go and get together. You could run commands on remote servers to go through and basically verify the kernel parms, the user IDs, the ulimits, file system mounts, etc. And I'm going to step you through a few scenarios of this. The more that you could sit down and be able to script, the better. And with what I'm going to be describing right here, it'd be nothing more than corn shell scripts that you could go through and put together. Or later, you could go through and put it into an Ansible playbook or a chef cookbook. Again, by doing something like this, it could be simple as just a corn shell script that you're going through and you're sending remote commands to these servers asking questions. It'll report back uh, uh, based off of your query to these individual servers. From the coordination server, he could go through and ask us a question from these servers, hey, give me information about your kernel parms, and he could return that in a report format for a human to be able to go through and review. Now, as an example here, with economies of skills, you want to reduce, if not eliminate, the need for a human to physically log into each machine. Okay, so that's why the coordination server is really important. Building a server is kind of like a workflow or a pipeline type concept. Other teams work on their pieces and hand off to the MQ team. Like I said, a Linux admin might go through and build out the Linux server for you in the file systems, but then you'll need to go and verify. And the more that you could be able to go through and script together, just even as a simple corn shell script to do some of that verification, believe me, that code could be used later when you're wanting to go into the cloud. Just doing these simple things up front. Tasks can be performed within the MQ team without outside help. It should follow small, manageable push verify routines. Breaking into smaller tasks to automate allows the team member to work on individual pieces of the overall workflow. Work out patterns for push, verify routines, document, and assign tasks through your Kanban board. So example, let's say that you go through and you say, okay, we need somebody to go through as part of the coordination server to write a routine to go out and check and make sure that the kernel parms and everything are set correctly. So he would go through, he would run that those sets of commands. How do you go through and check and see if the MQ server was built out there? An example, DSP-MQ VER would be one. Another one, there could be a series of MQ commands that you could go through and run to even get, I think it's MQ-ENV to be able to go, or MQ config, excuse me, to be able to go through and get the kernel parms that were already set on the machine as well, and return those back to the coordination server. So that, again, could be written in Corn shell as part of the verify coming back. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated. It could be very simple type code. But another a story that someone could go through and put together would be a queue manager create, where as part of the coordination server, and again, it could be nothing more than a Corn shell script that'll go through and say, okay, now I want you to go through and create these queue managers. And you could be working from a properties file to go through and know what the queue manager name is supposed to be for each individual server, the location of the to know what the location of the drive is, the mount for where the data and the logs are located. That could be all pushed out as well in a in like a parms file that could be ran on the server side on the right hand side, and the results sent back as part of a verify. And now as part of verify, you could go through and say, yes, the queue managers are created, the log is established, everything, and then a report and a server inventory checklist would be generated for those servers that you work with. And I'll show you in a moment what that server inventory sheet would look like. If you're going through and dealing with certificate management, you could go through, whether through the third-party certificate manager or through some other mechanism, you could go through and publish out and execute those certificates to the individual servers, and then again go through and run your verification to go through and make sure, yes, the certificate key stores are available, yes, the certificate is valid, all the queries or the general queries between these dozens of servers that you're rolling these changes out to go through and ensure that they've been completed. And I'm purposely not showing code here because that is, again, could be something like on the coordination server, nothing more than pushing up a shell script, something as simple as that, to be able to go off and do. And like I said, later, once the team gets comfortable with that concept, then they could go through and say, we want to start using Ansible, or we want to use something else. In this case right here, everyone needs to go through, or everyone should go through and have monitoring established as well. You notice from the previous slide, we didn't have a monitoring server involved yet, because this one is just involving a queue manager certificate. Here in the center, hopefully you can see my arrow here. Here in the center, we go through and we have a monitoring agent that needs to be pushed out as well, and most likely will be a monitoring central server that you need to go through and update as well to go and register these queue managers now to this monitoring server. So then now he would, the monitoring server would participate in this coordination as well. And as part of verification, you could go out there and do queries just to basically check on the health of that monitoring agent to go through and see, yes, you out there? Are you alive? Does the monitoring server know about them? And then that information will be relayed back to the server inventory checklist and or a report. This is the example of what the server build scenario report would go through and look like, or I should say the checklist. This would be something that the server build team would go and put together. Hopefully it could be in an automated manner, because the way I was going through and describing where between the push and the verify was part of a verify. You could go out and talk to each one of these servers, asking him questions like, okay, are your kernel params set correctly? User ID's already out there, your user limit settings, is your MQ server installed? For example, is logging all set up? And the idea behind this is the more you could automate this type of checklist or mark sheet for the actual server name, the better it's going to be, where, as you can see now, a human could be able to come through and take a look at this and say, okay, we need somebody to come work here on this MSVA server to come through and create the queue managers and establish the logging and the certificate. This one doesn't even have the fix pack out there. And again, dealing with economies of skill, even with you not being out in the cloud and being on-prem, something like this could be written fairly, I wouldn't say trivially, but this could be written with just some minimal effort, just using basic shell scripting abilities. And then that would go through and create your server inventory checklist. It's great because putting the extra effort to automate as much as possible ensures that each server follows the exact process and reduces the chance of a server configuration drift. The more servers that you have to support in your MQ network, the greater the risk you're going to have of this concept of a configuration drift, or I like calling it snowflake, where in the end you may go and have hundreds of queue managers out there across 50 or 60 servers, let's say, but there could be something that could be unique about each one of those servers, where they're unique, they're snowflaked off, where the configuration is not the same. And as part of going through again and having a coordination server go and push off this information, saying create the queue managers all this way, create the logging the same way, push out the certificates, the better the chance of you not having configuration drift. Now, the last few slides that we go and have here take you through a simple migration. And now again, we're back to the application enablement group that would be involved with this. And it'd be a team member within that group that'd be working with the application team. Going through somewhat of a scenario. And if you wanted to go more and know more about the security and how to be able to go through recommend ideas for security to set up, if you take a look at the previous webinar that I did on MQ upgrade best practices, that goes into more details about how to be able to go and set up your channel auths, how to be able to go through and consider connecting to like an LDAP server for authentication and authorization, and even practices for going through and establishing granular access to MQ objects as well, like in a local queue. In this case, let's say that you got a queue manager, which always happens. It doesn't matter what version it is in many ways, but it's shared by, in this case, application 1 and 2. App 1 and 2 are shared on the same queue manager. App 1 team is ready to migrate to version 9, but App 2 team won't be ready till 2020. These things happen all the time. And you may have to go through, in the end, the decision is made, okay, we'll upgrade this one application team and we'll wait for App 2 team to be ready in 2020. So in this case, what you would go through and do is for the App 1 team, you take an MQ object inventory of all the queues and topics that are used by application 1 and review with the app team. This is your opportunity to be able to go through and remove any unused queues or topics. This is what I call lift and shift. The idea of a lift and shift is that you're going to go through and you're going to upgrade MQ. You're going to, instead of doing an in-place migration, you're creating a whole new server refresh. Okay, there's a whole new server, a whole new queue manager, and you're going to take those MQ objects, you're going to lift them from the old environment, and you're going to shift them over to the new environment. And just like moving a home, you don't want to move objects or things that in the end you have no value for, and then you may end up just throwing away a week or two later. So as part of the person assigned from the application enablement group, they would work with the application teams and probably even the MQ team as well to go through and identify the MQ objects that are no longer in use. The ones that aren't in use, then you go through and you put together your plan for retiring those. And then here is an example between, let's say, an MQ75 queue manager and a 9 queue manager. Then what will happen is here we go through and we indicate the objects that were meant, that are going to end up being meant for app 1 to be running over here will exist. We'll have our alias queues and our local queues if that's what we use. And so in the end, what happens is application 2 still goes and uses his classic queue manager. And then the new app 1 could be able to go through and start using their new queue manager. And the thing that I don't show you here is that there would be some connectivity between these two queue managers. They'd be shared in the same cluster, for example. But this is me going and showing a basic lift and shift of the objects and then setting their appropriate auth recs between these two applications. And believe me, I know in this case it's a very simplistic example, and I definitely know when going through scenarios like this, in the end, it could be hundreds of MQ objects that need to be lifted and shifted between two queue managers, and that you couldn't fully retire one of them yet. You got to keep them going. But that would be an example of the application enablement group. And one of the final slides that I got here to show is just like with the server group, when I was describing that they would go through and have a coordination server for pushing out or verification of the servers, pushing out any patches or creating queue managers and pushing out certificates and stuff. The application enablement group could also do the same thing with even things as simple as a corn shell script to be able to go through and push out those MQSE commands and maybe even go through and update the monitoring server that would be specific for this application to be able to go through and start running under its new environment. And again, the more that you go through and start thinking out, even at the simplistic levels on your coordination server, and then putting together your checklist and a report, the easier it's going to be when you will be upgrading to true cloud enablement within the next few years. More companies are going to be doing that. But this presentation right here was what I would consider the twilight of you getting yourself ready for a true DevOps movement. Start thinking about automation, being able not to touch these servers anymore, or as much as possible, don't touch them. If you go and got to send configuration changes, go and do it through a series of commands that would be pushed out to those servers. And that is considered the end of my presentation. I don't know if there's any questions anybody has they'd like to ask. Jeff, is the lines open if anyone wanted to ask a question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They can. You guys feel free to type it in either chat or in the Q&A. Let us know any questions you might have. We'll wait I don't know, maybe another minute or so to see if anybody has any questions. Doesn't seem like they do so far.
And the thing I'll go through and I'll let the group know again, we here at TxMQ would love to help you be able to go and work smarter in your environment, whether it's on-prem or being able to go and help you enable your environment out into cloud as well. So hopefully through these presentations that we give, you'll feel confident enough that we could help you get into the DevOps economy and API economy with confidence.
Okay, I don't see any questions. So, thanks everybody. Thanks absolutely, John, for, giving us this presentation today. That concludes the entire presentation. We're going to have the recording available as well as the slides for download sometime in the next week. So if you're interested, just keep an eye out in your email for a link, and we're going to be sending those out to you. And feel free to share with your colleagues, of course. Appreciate you guys taking the time to be with us. We hope everyone was able to take away maybe a little bit of something from our presentation today. Just stay tuned in the future for more from us. In the near future, we hope to be doing a couple more of these. So enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.